On the morning of January 13, 1984, the board of Commodore International sat down in a conference room to review numbers most companies never see in a lifetime. The company had just closed its best quarter ever, more than $400 million in 3 months. A full year of sales past $1 billion, and a profit of $100 million on top of it. Commodore was, at that exact moment, the largest computer company on Earth. In that room sat 2 men who had built it together. Jack Tramiel, a survivor of Auschwitz who had started the company repairing broken typewriters in the Bronx, and Irving Gould, the investor who chaired its board and controlled its money. Before the meeting ended, the 2 men clashed. Tramiel stood up, walked out of the building, and never came back. He did not return the next day, or the week after, or ever again. Nobody outside that room fully agrees on what was said, but everyone agrees on what happened next. The company that had just posted the best numbers in its history began falling apart within months. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how one argument, on one morning, at the peak of everything Commodore had built, set in motion the 10 years that ended in bankruptcy. To understand why that walkout mattered so much, you have to understand what Jack Tramiel had already survived to get there. He was born Jack Tramiel in Lodz, Poland in 1928. As a teenager, he was sent to the Lodz ghetto, then to Auschwitz, where he was examined by Josef Mengele and selected for a work detail instead of the gas chamber. He was moved to a labor camp near Hanover, where his own father died. In April 1945, American soldiers liberated the camp. Tramiel was 17 years old and weighed barely more than a child. 2 years later, he arrived in the United States. He used a small army loan to open a typewriter repair shop in the Bronx. He needed a name for the business, something with authority. The military ranks admiral and general were already taken by other companies, so he picked the next one down the list, Commodore. Through the 1950s, that repair shop grew into a manufacturer, first of typewriters, then adding machines, then calculators, always chasing the next machine before someone else could sell it first. In 1958, he formalized the company as Commodore Business Machines. In 1966, a Canadian financier named Irving Gould bought a stake in the struggling company for $500,000 and became its chairman. Gould brought money and a board seat. He never brought a product idea. For the next 18 years, that division of labor, Tramiel Building, Gould Financing, would define the company. Nobody yet knew how much it would matter who was actually in charge when things went wrong. Commodore's real weapon was not any single product. It was Tramiel's memory. Years earlier, Texas Instruments had nearly destroyed his calculator business by selling finished calculators for less than Commodore could even buy the parts. Tramiel never forgot it, and he swore that the next time a rival tried to undercut him, he would already own the factory making the parts. In 1976, he got his chance. A struggling chip maker called Moss Technology, designer of a cheap and powerful new processor called the 6502, was drowning in debt. Commodore bought it outright. Now Commodore did not just build computers, it built the chips inside them, at a cost no rival using outside suppliers could match. In 1977, that chip became the heart of the Commodore PET, the company's first true computer. When Commodore needed a programming language for it, a young Bill Gates offered to license his basic software for $3 per machine sold. Tramiel refused. He offered a single flat payment of $25,000 for unlimited, permanent use instead. Gates took the deal. He would later call it one of the worst business decisions of his career. Commodore kept building on that foundation. The VIC-20 launched in 1981 at $299 and became the first computer in history to sell over 1 million units. Then, in August 1982, came the Commodore 64, a machine so capable and so cheap to manufacture that Commodore could do something no rival could survive. In June 1983, it slashed the price to $299, undercutting everyone. Texas Instruments, the same company that had once nearly destroyed Commodore's calculator business, tried to match the price and lost hundreds of millions of dollars doing it. By October, Texas Instruments abandoned the home computer market entirely. Tramiel had gotten his revenge. twice. By the last quarter of 1983, Commodore controlled roughly a third of the entire home computer market and had just posted the best financial numbers in its history. And that is the state the company was in when Tramiel and Gould sat down together on January 13, 1984. What exactly caused the final break is still disputed. One account, from Tramiel's own son decades later, says Jack confronted Gould over using company assets for personal benefit, telling him plainly that it was wrong while Jack was still president. Gould's answer was a single word: goodbye. A different account, from a former managing director of Commodore's UK office, says the real fight was about Tramiel's 3 sons, who he wanted placed in senior roles at the company, a demand Gould refused to accept. Both stories may be partly true. What is certain is this: Tramiel walked out of that boardroom, and Commodore's chairman let him go, rather than give an inch. Gould told reporters afterward that the split was amicable, that Tramiel had simply been working too hard for too long. Within days, Commodore announced his replacement, a steel industry executive named Marshall Smith, who had never sold a computer or a calculator in his life. The man who had spent 30 years anticipating exactly how a rival would try to kill his business had just been replaced by someone who had never had to think about it at all. If you want to understand exactly how expensive that trade turned out to be, stay with me, because what happened in the following months is where this story actually turns. Here is the fatal logic nobody at Commodore fully reckoned with that January morning. Tramiel's ruthlessness was not a personality quirk sitting on top of a good business. It was the business. Every major win, the MOS technology purchase that gave Commodore its own chip supply, the $25,000 basic deal, the price war that buried Texas Instruments, came from one man who treated every competitor as a personal enemy to be destroyed, not a market condition to be managed around a boardroom table. Gould had removed the one person willing to fight that hard, and he did it without lining up anyone who could fight that same way in his place. The irony arrived almost immediately. Within months, Tramiel founded a new company and used it to buy the struggling consumer division of Atari from Warner Communications, turning the man who had built Commodore into Commodore's direct rival on store shelves everywhere. That same summer, Commodore purchased a small startup called Amiga Corporation to build its next-generation computer. Amiga had once taken development money from Atari in exchange for a year of exclusive rights to its chip technology. Tramiel, now Atari's owner, sued Commodore over the deal, arguing the sale should have voided that older agreement. For years afterward, the company Tramiel built and the company he now owned fought each other in courtrooms over the very technology meant to carry Commodore into its next decade. Without Tramiel, Commodore lost more than a leader, it lost a filter. Marshall Smith lasted 2 years before departing in 1986. His successor, Thomas Rattigan, was pushed out in 1987 after losing a fight for control of his own boardroom, the second chief executive in 3 years to leave under a cloud. In the confusion, Commodore rushed out the Commodore 16 and the Plus 4, machines that looked like the C64's siblings, but could not run any of the software libraries built for it, confusing the exact customers who had trusted the brand for years and buying Commodore a reputation for releasing computers nobody had actually asked for. Meanwhile, the Amiga, the computer meant to be Commodore's future, and the reason it had gone to court against Tramiel in the first place, kept slipping further behind its own release schedule and further behind its own marketing budget. By 1989, a new president, Mehdi Ali, had taken charge with a simple mandate from the board: cut costs wherever they could be cut. He gutted the research budgets that had once funded chip designs years ahead of anyone else in the industry, and Commodore's engineering advantage, the same advantage Tramiel had spent a decade building brick by brick, began quietly disappearing. The company that once out-engineered and outpriced every rival on Earth was now simply trying not to spend money. The years that followed were a slow bleed, dressed up as strategy. Under Mehdi Ali, factories kept producing Amiga 600 computers that stores could not sell, while the more popular Amiga 500 and Amiga 1200 models sat in short supply, a scheduling failure that frustrated retailers and customers at the exact moment Commodore needed both on its side. David Pleasance, who ran Commodore's UK office at the time, later called the Amiga 600, launch a complete and utter failure. Engineers who had once been proud to work at the company grew openly bitter. Frustrated staff reportedly burned an effigy of Ali in protest, even as his own compensation rose during the very years the company was falling apart. From roughly $1.4 million in 1989 to $2 million the following year. In 1990, Commodore released the CD-TV, a home entertainment computer built for a market that did not exist yet. It flopped. In 1993 came the Amiga CD32, marketed internally as the machine that would save the company. It sold reasonably well in parts of Europe, but nowhere near enough to repair a decade of shrinking margins, gutted research budgets, and boardroom chaos. On April 29, 1994, Commodore International filed for bankruptcy and began liquidating its assets. By then, only its operations in Canada, Germany, and the United Kingdom were still turning a profit. Everywhere else, the losses had simply outrun whatever cost-cutting was left to try. A little over a year later, in April 1995, a German computer maker called Escom bought what remained of the Commodore and Amiga brands for $14 million, beating out a rival bid from Dell. The company that had once been the largest computer maker on the planet had just been sold for less than the cost of a small office building. The irony did not stop with the sale. Escom itself collapsed into bankruptcy just over a year later, in July 1996, taking a second owner down with the very brand it had rescued. The Amiga technology and Commodore's own patents eventually passed to Gateway 2000, an American computer maker that, in one of the stranger coincidences in this industry's history, would go on to make its own catastrophic strategic mistake a few years later and collapse into an acquisition of its own. Jack Tramiel, meanwhile, watched all of it unfold from a distance. His own venture, Atari Corporation, never became the giant. Commodore had been under his hand, and he stepped back from the industry entirely by the mid-1990s, quietly wealthy and largely unbothered by what had happened to the company that still carried his name. He died in 2012 at the age of 83, having outlived Commodore International by 18 years. Irving Gould, the man who chose to let him walk away rather than compromise that January morning, spent the rest of his own life largely out of the public eye. His name remembered today mostly by the people who study exactly how a company this dominant could fall apart this completely. It is tempting to look at Commodore's collapse and blame the products. The Amiga 600 nobody wanted, the CD-TV nobody asked for, the Plus4 that confused its own customers. But every one of those decisions was made by people trying to run a fighter's company without the fighter. Commodore did not lose to Apple or IBM or any rival with a better computer, the way most of the companies on this channel eventually do. It lost the one person inside its own walls who was willing to burn a competitor to the ground rather than lose to them. And it spent the next 10 years discovering that discipline and vision are much harder to replace than a chip supplier or a factory. The best-selling computer in history was built by a man who treated every rival as a war to be won. The company that built it was slowly dismantled by a decade of executives who only ever knew how to manage the peace. If you want more stories about the companies that built entire industries and then lost the one thing that made them dangerous, subscribe. There is a new one every week. And if you are ever one of the millions of people who grew up loading games off a cassette tape on a Commodore 64, tell us in the comments which one you remember waiting for the longest.